Coming up on today's episode, we are looking at health psychology. What is it? What does it involve? How do you do it? Do you get paid? And what are the differences across the UK for how the courses are set up? I am interviewing an end-stage health trainee psychologist, and the conversation is lively, wholesome and nourishing. We talk about grief, we talk about death, we talk about strength, we talk about wellness, and of course, health psychology. It is a wonderful listen, and I hope you find it so useful. Welcome along to the Aspiring Psychologist podcast. I'm Dr. Marianne Trent, and I'm a qualified clinical psychologist. Thank you so much for listening, for watching. It's one of my key responsibilities, I feel, for this podcast to illuminate different areas of professional psychology qualifications. And one that we haven't covered as yet, but I have been very keen to do so, is health psychology. Let's dive in. I hope you find this episode as beautiful as I found it to record. I will catch you on the other side. Just want to welcome along Nicola O'Donnell to the podcast. Hi, Nicola.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for saying yes. I really wanted to talk to you primarily because you're a trainee health psychologist, but I know you've got so much more going on that's going to be really interesting for me to listen to and speak with you about, but also, of course, our audience as well. So before we crash into some of that, could you tell us a little bit about you and kind of how you got into psychology?
Yes, it's always I feel like such a long journey for so many people to get into psychology and to qualify or nearly qualify, as is the case for me. So thinking back in preparation for today, I first started sort of studying psychology in 2010 when I took it for my A-level, and just fell in love with the subject and felt like for the first time in my life it was something that I was good at. I was always sort of pretty average at school, but when I started doing psychology, I thought, oh, actually, this is something that I want to do. So I decided to go to university to study it further. So in 2012, I did my undergraduate at the University of Kent in applied psychology with clinical psychology. And I think the sort of crunch point for me within that was I did a placement year. So I did a 4-year undergraduate, and for the third year spent a whole year working in the NHS, kind of as an assistant psychologist within paediatrics, and just absolutely loved it and solidified that this is what I want to do as a job. So, I mean, I think I can go into more if I'm not talking too much, but I was really lucky and completely credit my placement year to the fact that I was successful in getting an assistant psychologist job immediately after my undergraduate course. So I started a assistant role in CAMS, so Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, and they very kindly encouraged me to do a further qualification in low intensity CBT. So I was quickly in getting experience working with children and young people one-to-one, their families, offering low intensity cognitive behaviour therapy, particularly for things like low mood and anxiety, but also working within a wider eating disorder service as well. So I was really lucky to get quite a lot of hands-on experience quite quickly. So for a long time, I didn't know that health psychology was a thing. I didn't know that it existed. I always knew that I was interested in working psychologically in health settings, but I thought that clinical psychology would be the only way to do that. And I actually applied for clinical psychology doctorate on 3 occasions and was offered interviews and twice a reserve place that never came through to joining a course, which I found really, really hard at the time. But I'm very grateful now that it kind of led me in a different direction in discovering what health psychology is, and how to go about becoming a health psychologist, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. So I enrolled on my master's in 2020, so COVID, did my whole master's at UCL, but from home, which was challenging, but also gave me something to do, I suppose, during lockdown. And then later enrolled on my final stage of training, stage 2, in 2022, which I will qualify from hopefully next month. So all coming to an end very soon. Haven't even mentioned the PhD in that, but
Okay, we'll come back to the PhD in a moment.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
thank you so much. That's really, really interesting. And like as you talk, I'm like, you have travelled quite a lot for your career, haven't you? Because I know just before we hit record, you were like, "Oh, I've just moved from Suffolk, and now I'm actually up north." And there's been some other, you said I think you said your undergrad was Kent. So there's been a lot
Yeah.
of movement, and that is not uncommon in the psychology field as well. But just to follow up on what you said about your UCL distance learning, so that's for your health psychology professional qualifications. It starts as a master's, and then it sounds like there's an additional bit. Could you tell us about that and how that extra bit works? Do some people not choose to do that? I presume that's so you can go on and be registered as a practitioner psychologist with the HCPC. That's why you do the extra bit, is it?
Yeah, so in order to practice as a health psychologist, you have to do both what's known as stage 1 and stage 2. And I'm really passionate about explaining this in hopefully an accessible way, because I think compared to lots of other psychology training routes, health psychology is really confusing. You have to do a lot of digging around to find out how you actually enroll to become a health psychologist. And it's something that I'm asked on a weekly basis. How does it all work, and how do I go about doing it? So from the beginning, you obviously have to do an undergraduate in psychology, which you would do for all routes of further psychology training, and helpful to have some experience working clinically as well, in order to make sure firstly that you enjoy the subject, but also to give you some real life, real world experience of what a psychologist does, and applying some of those theoretical concepts that you spend so long learning about into sort of real life and working with real people. And then the master's that I mentioned is the stage 1 of doctoral training. So this is usually a year full time, and it's really important that everyone who wants to become a health psychologist does this, because it gives you that broad grounding of major health psychology theories and concepts. And that is accredited by the BPS, the British Psychological Society, just like an undergraduate usually would have been. And some people stop there. Some people go on and do lots of varied and interesting things from that master's. But if you want to practice as a qualified health psychologist, you need to do what's known as stage 2. And this is where it gets a bit complicated, because there's lots of different ways that you can do that. And I'll obviously speak more about the way that I've done it, but I'll give a brief overview of the different ways you can do it, because I think this is the thing that people find most confusing. So the first option is doing a doctorate in health psychology at a university. I think quite like clinical psychology, you have a structured training program, you have a cohort of peers, and you access your training in this way. I did not do that. The second option is what's known as the independent route, and that takes a minimum of 2 years. And instead of being attached to a course and a university, you're attached to a supervisor under the BPS. And you have 2 years at least of structured and supervised practice in order to meet the health psychology competencies, which are professional practice, consultancy, psychological interventions, research, and teaching and training. And many people like me do this alongside an academic PhD, so that you get a dual qualification and can utilize your PhD to fulfill the stage 2 research competency. But equally, you can do just the stage 2 on its own without the PhD. But I suppose it's worth knowing that you can't use the title of doctor if you haven't done the PhD with that independent route.
I see.
So that's what I did.
That is quite confusing.
And that's not even all the options. There's still another
Oh,
two.
yeah.
So
Go for it. Tell me the other two. I'm sorry. Go for it.
So the Health Education England, as of 2 years ago, have a funded programme, which I suppose is the draw because the others are self-funded, which is aiming to apply health behaviour change to NHS workforce redesign. So I think there's 7 funded places in England for that. So that's a relatively new route. And then there's an NHS
Do you mean 7 funded courses or literally 7 funded places
people.
for the whole of
Yeah,
England?
7 people. Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah.
days, that's not a lot, is it?
Yeah. Not a lot. So I
Are
think
they
it will grow.
remote? Are they in person, or are they attached to one particular university?
So they're attached to an individual area within or region within England. So again, I won't speak too much to it because I'm not doing this route, but my understanding is that each trainee is allocated to an area like the east of England, and then they do their work within that particular area, focusing on workforce redesign within the NHS. So not many people are funded to do that, but I think it is a growing way to become a health psychologist, and one that hopefully will gain more and more funding as well.
Okay, but they're flying solo then, so they haven't got someone else living locally because there's 7 across England, so they're probably living in very different areas of the country.
Yeah, although I do think from knowing people that are on that training route that they have a really strong and supportive network between them. But yeah, geographically very spread apart. And then the last route's NHS Scotland, which Scotland seem to be so far ahead in health psychology. They've been offering funded training for years, and that is very similar to clinical psychology in the way that you're employed under the NHS, offering sort of health psychology services as a trainee. So lots of different ways that you can go about becoming a health psychologist, and not always very clear the differences.
No, but actually really, really important. And it sounds like this episode is so overdue, because actually if you're getting asked that a lot, I didn't know this stuff, and I'm another professional psychologist, so this is really, really timely. So thank you for illuminating us about the pathways. So other than Scotland and other than the 7 places that you may or may not be lucky enough to get, it's self-funded. Does that mean that you are having to work? Does that mean that you're eligible to claim kind of student support finance, all of that jazz, or do you just need to be, hoping that you've got an employer who'll pay, or a generous aunt who how does it come about? How does it come together?
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that is really unclear for a lot of people. So as I mentioned, some of the routes are funded, so that isn't something that those trainees have to consider. For people on the doctorate courses, you are able to apply for post-doctoral loans. And speaking to a friend doing that yesterday, she said at the moment you're able to claim, I think, about £28,000 across the course of your doctorate to help live and work and pay for the course. And the independent route is self-funded. So that's what I've done. I think it's always a struggle advising people on this, because I feel like I've got quite a unique situation when it came to funding. And it isn't a particularly cheerful situation, but essentially, very sadly, my dad died in 2020, and that enabled me to pay for my training. But I also work as a researcher and have done throughout my course to top up my living expenses, alongside my PhD stipend that I have as well. So I kind of have juggled a lot of different things in order to make it work over the last few years, which isn't easy, but it is doable.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear about your dad. I lost my dad in 2017, and it's not easy. You know,
Mm.
we're young women. You're even younger than me. It isn't easy, you know, and especially I think losing someone at that time of the pandemic, it's really, really tricky. I, like you, received some inheritance from my father, which meant that I was able to pay for my EMDR training. And so I feel like every kind of trauma intervention, every time I'm on TV doing anything trauma related, you know, any client work, my dad's with me. And I really, really like that because he'd always been
Mm.
so supportive of my career. You know, he always wanted to hear what I was up to, and obviously not disclosing clinical information, but he was always my fiercest, you know, supporter. And so, you know, I
Mm.
hope that you have that experience, and I hope that you still have that felt sense of your dad throughout your studies. And you know, I think when you qualify after all of this time, it's going to be even more emotional. You're suddenly in a position where you're able to get paid in one job to do one job. And suddenly all, you don't have academic assignments, you don't have thesis, you don't have, all these different things. I just feel like you're going to there'll be a realization and you'll have a really good cry. And it'll just be a very special, messy time, but, you know, so much to be proud of.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I think I won't know what to do with myself. And yeah, I'm really sorry to hear about your dad as well, because it is such a hugely difficult thing, I think, whatever age you are. But I think particularly, I was only 25 at the time, and it was and is really difficult. And I think what you said is so accurate. Actually, I feel like he would really like that his money has led me to train in the profession that I've always wanted to. So, yeah, it's a really nice reminder of that when things feel particularly difficult, I suppose.
It really does. It really does. And I randomly I can connect to my dad with my weird knobbly wrists. Like, I don't know if I have strangely knobbly wrists. And it was when my dad was unwell in hospital. I was like, oh, I've always looked at your knobbly wrists and mine, but I've never quite realized where they've come from. But he has them as well. And, you know, just small things like that, you know, I've got two children as well. And one of them's really sad that he doesn't get to be, didn't really get to know Grumpy Norm, and Grumpy Norm didn't get to know him. But I'm still so thankful that I got to, you know, for him to be a grandparent to three children at the time that he died, because we've got a niece, and now we've got two others as well. So we've got quite a big family. So I've got two, and my brother's got three, in case that wasn't clear. But yeah, like, it's really, really difficult. And actually, it feels like it's an appropriate time to mention a charity that I've worked with called It's Time. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're on Instagram, and they specialize in supporting the bereavement, grief, and loss needs of people who've lost parents at 25 or below. So they
Mm.
support people that have lost, you know, in their own childhood. But actually, it is uniquely destabilizing, you know, being younger and losing a parent, because, you know, what a lot of their kind of people that they support experiences, even when they go to university, they might be coming home but not really coming home, and a parent might meet a new partner and then kind of
Mm.
downsize or move, that it means that there's not actually any room for them. It's a very unique process and can feel very alienating. And actually, one of the things that's helped me grow up the most and helped me advance clinically probably is losing my dad. But you don't
Mm.
know until you know it. I didn't know that I was a worse clinician. I didn't know that I was a worse human. I didn't know that. But actually, I quite liked the naivety of that, you know. So yes,
Mm.
I've grown. Yes, I've developed. It's post-traumatic growth, but I probably would rather I'd rather be a worse human and still have my dad. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I think just agree with everything that you say. And it's so good to hear about charities that are supporting that age group, because although I didn't specifically access a charity, I think particularly between like 20 and 25, there's such a gap in services for things like grief, because you're not a child and you're not properly necessarily an adult either. And you kind of are a between services. And, you know, it's not the norm for a parent to die when you're that age. So your friends can't really, thankfully, relate either. So I think it's really great that there's charities out there working specifically with that age range. I think that's really great.
You don't want them to be able to relate, do you? Like, it's a weird position. You know, they don't really get it. And
Mm.
you kind of want to be supported, but you know that they can't necessarily, unless they're very, very special, they can't necessarily support you in the way that you might need. It's a very, very strange time. But thank you so much for being so honest about that. You know, we are humans first and we're psychologists second, but it often is part of our why, isn't it? And I think that's, you know, thank you for being so raw, so vulnerable, so honest. And I know this will resonate with so many people. Can we think a little bit about what health psychology is? You know, what might give us a few examples of kind of ideal client avatars, as we say in marketing? You know, what sort of work could we hope to achieve? So you've mentioned kind of service redesign and stuff, which isn't really something I'd considered from a health angle, but be useful to get an overview of kind of clinical work as well.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that health psychologists often work in so many different settings that I definitely won't be able to touch on them all. But I suppose broadly, health psychology as a discipline is relatively young compared to many others like clinical or counselling psychology, the roots that people are perhaps more familiar with. But in simple terms, health psychology is really the study of how our thoughts, our emotions, behaviours, and our social factors like relationships, cultural influences, socio-economic status interact to affect our physical health. So it's all about understanding how our mental and emotional well-being can impact our overall physical well-being and vice versa, and exploring how people stay healthy, why they get ill, and how they respond once they are unwell as well. So I think quite a big part of health psychology is firstly helping people to make healthier behavioral choices. So whether that's stopping smoking, exercising more, to manage stress, cope when they are diagnosed with illnesses like cancer, and to improve their overall physical and mental quality of life more broadly. For example, in my clinical work whilst on training, I've worked with people who are either undergoing cancer treatment or are in remission from cancer, and thinking about what is going on for them, particularly in terms of their worries, their thoughts and feelings around their recovery, and things, particularly in cancer, about recurrence. So I guess that's not too dissimilar to how a clinical psychologist might work with someone, but also thinking about motivation to change certain behaviors as well. So you might have someone who has had cancer but is still engaging with smoking, or is perhaps needing to lose some weight for their health, and how motivated they are to change, and how you can support them to move beyond intending to make changes to actually going and doing them. Because we know that intentions, you can have the best intentions in the world, but it doesn't necessarily always lead to doing something different. So working out why that might be is an example of something that a health psychologist might do.
Thank you. That's so illuminating. And it's really reminded me of my doctoral research, which was actually, it was clinical, but it probably also would have fitted nicely within health. It's probably probably more relevant to health, actually. It was looking at the health change behaviours that a spouse might or might not make after their long-term partner has had a serious stroke. With my kind of thinking that, you know, what we're looking at in stroke is modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors. And when something so awful happens that somebody is incapacitated, my sense was, how does that not make you go, gosh, well, I'm going to exercise more, I'm going to quit smoking, I'm going to, you know, think about my BMI, you know, all of those things. And there was some post-traumatic growth from that. You know, people really welcomed the social support that they had as a result of that. But the general findings were, no, they don't tend to look at their own modifiable risk factors. And when we were exploring that, it was all done during grounded theory and was one-to-one interviews. And they were like, there's just no time for me. There's not that time for me to be able to focus on myself. You know, there's lots of sitting around in hospitals initially, and then that feels awful. And then they come home, and then you realize that that's the real journey. There's so much stress. There's learning to be, well, it's grief, isn't it? It's the loss
Mm-hmm.
of a spousal relationship, and then trying to think about what aspects of that you can keep alive and around, and then obviously being someone's carer. And if there's no, it's tricky, isn't it? I'm sure you're well aware that people who own their homes often are in a position where they're not eligible to receive any, in England certainly, receive any
Mm.
free social care. And so you might get
Yeah.
in a position where you're having to support your husband or your wife or your long-term partner with their personal care, even though you wouldn't want that, they wouldn't want that. But otherwise, you're going to have to sell your home. And even then, you'd be too wealthy to be able to afford, to get the free social care. It sounds like a case of my diamond shoes are too tight, but it's really not like that in reality, is it?
No, I think, and that's just like a perfect example of how complex situations are in reality for people. Receiving a diagnosis of any kind of serious illness on its own, it's devastating, but then it's obviously impacting the people around you, if you have people around you, that is. Your finances, ability to work, the stigma that potentially comes up, changes in relationships with friends as well. It goes on and on and on. There's so much of an impact, isn't there, when there's illness involved, which is of course what health psychology is often focused on, people who are physically unwell, and then that understandably has an impact on their mental health as well, because if you're not well and all these other things are happening, it's not going to feel great. So obviously very normal to feel not great emotionally, but that can then become a problem in itself as well.
Yes, indeed it can. I feel like I could talk to you all day. Like, you're so easy to talk to, and I'm so interested in everything you're talking about. Has it made you think about your own health, your own mortality? My little boy, we were at a McDonald's party the other day, and he said, "Can we have some nuggets to share as well as my food?" And I was like, "No, no, baby. We're here for a long time, not just a good time." Like, because I do, and my friend who I was with, she was like, "I'm not. I'm just here for a good time." Like, and I'm like, there's differences, isn't there? But for me, generally, I try to raise my boys to think about their eating, like not to be really, really hyper focused. The fact that we're in McDonald's to begin with, we're clearly not that virtuous. But I really do. I think, especially since the pandemic, like I've just before we met, I'm just back from my second personal training session of the week. Like, I've never been fitter, stronger, or healthier than I am at the age of 42, and I absolutely love that. I wish I'd been more interested in exercise when I was younger. Like, it wasn't really a big part of my family growing up. It's something that boys did. Really, boys went to football, and girls might do netball, but if just a dabble here and there. And
Mm.
my mum's always cooked from scratch. There's lots of lentils, lots of kind of whole foods, and you know
Mm.
all of that jazz. But so I think I had kind of good kind of input at an early age, and I learned to cook from an early age. But I was coasting. I was never that intentional. I was never that purposeful. And really, it's only over the last 4 years that I have become so. And I am so proud that I am strong. So almost a year ago, I broke my arm falling off my bike, and I'm like, just rubbish. My first break at the age of 41, I was then. But I really used this last year to think about getting stronger, getting healthier again, and getting back to where I am. And I'm absolutely there. And very long, warbled question, but how has this impacted on your own health journey, if that's not too personal a question to ask?
I think it's not something that I immediately thought of, particularly my sort of interests and where I've ended up in health psychology have been quite focused on specific areas like cancer, on pediatrics as well. So things that aren't directly linked to me, thankfully. So it's not something that's in my mind on a day-to-day basis, but I suppose definitely within the masters that was, as I mentioned, during COVID, when health and health behaviour was for the first time ever probably in the mainstream, something that everyone was thinking about. It definitely made me think about myself as a person and the people around me in terms of our fitness and health. And as I'm saying this, I think I hadn't linked it before, but during COVID, I, for the first time ever, having not been someone that was ever good at running or sport or anything, decided to train for triathlon. So I guess inadvertently it did influence me and think about my motivations. And I think for lots of young women, and this is probably a whole topic in itself for another day, but a lot of young women, and certainly amongst my friends, we have conversations about societal expectations on women around weight and body image, and growing up in a certain era and sort of diet culture, and having to look a certain way being quite ingrained in a lot of us. It was interesting to think about my motivations and training for an event like a triathlon, moving away from things like weight and how you look to ability, being strong and being generally fit and well, rather than so exercising for health rather than for image. So I think that's definitely something that came up and is something that is more on my radar, definitely through health psychology.
Absolutely. And the word for me that is conjured up when you're speaking is vibrant. Like, I want to be vibrantly healthy. I want to be strong. And that might not mean that I'm the skinniest I could ever be. Like, it's not about that. It's about
Mm.
knowing that my body is capable and, is I'm able to do all the things I want to do, like pick up my children, even though one of them's 10, but insist on being carried sometimes. Like, I want to be, like I said, I want to be here for a long time, not just a good time. And whilst, absolutely, you've been speaking about locus of control, often a lot of the work that you're doing sounds like it's with people who haven't had a locus of control for their illness. But actually, I I would love the idea that if I face an untimely end, that my body's in such a great condition that I'm able to be a really brilliant organ donor, So I'm not just looking after myself now, I'm looking after, hopefully, future people if
Yeah.
I have an untimely end. I don't want that to happen, let's not let's not let that come to fruition. But, I am here to enrich my own world, other people to be here for my family, but, I'm looking after myself.
Yeah, and I think so much is about that prevention work as well. So you're hopefully reducing your likelihood of developing preventable illnesses. And if you are in a situation of being diagnosed with something, that your body is fit and well enough to cope with that illness in itself, but also the treatment as well. So I think it definitely puts you into a different perspective thinking about health and things that you can do behaviorally to try and improve your health outcomes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Even, when I broke my arm, so what's this one? My left arm. It's all backwards. I can't see which is which on here. But I could only get it to like here to begin with.
Mm.
Because what we often don't really realize is even within 2 days of not using our bodies as we usually would do, our tendons all shrink and contract, don't they? And our muscles start to waste away because we're conserving that energy. The body, that's what my physio told me at the time, the body goes, oh, we're not using that, let's not waste that, let's save that, let's kind of almost reabsorb that. So the body is trying to be really helpful and smart, but actually means that it takes so much more to stretch those tendons, to stretch that body again once you have lost that fitness. So to begin with, I'm not wearing the best dress for it, I probably can't demonstrate it very well, and this is terrible if you're listening to it, but if you're watching it on YouTube, it's great. I couldn't get it beyond there, but now I can fully touch my shoulder again, which actually when I first started the physio, she didn't think I would necessarily get to based on where I was, but I wasn't prepared. So I didn't get NHS physio. I wasn't prepared to settle for an arm that didn't bend. So thankfully I was in a position where I was able to pay for some private physio, but it's really empowering people to know that even though you might not, have the best outcomes, you can do something, you can take action to make it different, hopefully.
Mm. Yeah, and you mentioned locus of control, and I'm well aware this is very like geeky thing to say, but locus of control and health locus of control are definitely two of the models that I like a lot and draw on a lot. And I think often when it comes to health, people feel quite powerless. People feel like they haven't got much say in what's happening to them, what their treatment is. And I suppose in the past, there was much more of a sort of a medical model of, I'm a doctor, I'm a professional, and I'm going to do to you what I think is best, and you will just do it. Whereas now there's much more of a dialogue of, well, what do you think? What would be best for you? Taking into account a person as a whole, and giving them some of that control, which ultimately is going to make you feel psychologically more able to cope and hopefully lead to better outcomes as well. So I think control is such a huge thing in so many aspects of life and health as well.
It really is. And as you spoke, I was thinking about when I first heard of the term locus of control, and it was during my A-level psychology. And I also heard about
Mm-hmm.
Loftus and, the bystander effect and all of that jazz, which brings us
Yeah.
nicely into the fact that you also do psychology tutoring as well, don't you? Tell our audience. So we do actually have A-level students listening. We have undergraduate students listening. We sometimes have GCSE psychology students listening. I know it's not super common, but we really have got a wide range of people. We also have qualified psychologists who listen too. But something that's cropped up with me working with young people is that they believe that accessing a tutor is cheating. And I've sort of always tried to say, what about the Olympic athletes who have coaches? Is that cheating too? And they're like, no. But how can people give themselves permission to optimize their performance by, and access appropriate tutoring? And why is that important?
Yeah. And I think it's really important to think about, because a lot of people, as you say, either don't know that it is an option to have a tutor alongside wherever it is that you're learning your course, whether it's school or college or somewhere else, but also have lots of different ideas about whether it's allowed, whether it's giving you more of an advantage than it should, etc., etc. So I think firstly to say, loads of people have tutoring, and I think it's important to say it's not always accessible to everyone because it's not free, but there is free resources out there that are, accessible to everyone. But one-to-one tutoring, like I offer, through a platform called First Tutors, what happens is people usually get in touch with me. I say most often they're A-level students, but sometimes it's undergraduate or even master students as well. And sometimes that's because people are struggling with a very specific aspect of their course, whether that's statistics, that's a common one, or whether they're sort of just struggling with the subject as a whole and want to give themselves some more time to improve their understanding, have the chance to ask questions that there may be no time for at school, or maybe you feel, quite shy about asking questions in front of all your peers, lots of different reasons. So tutoring and the chance to spend an hour one-to-one with someone who hopefully knows a bit about the subject can be really helpful for people. And I was just tutoring someone this morning who I've worked with throughout the entirety of her A-level. And that's not to say that she was struggling at all. I think quite the opposite. She's actually very able and is looking to do the best she possibly can. So uses the sessions to work on not so much understanding the concepts, but developing her critical evaluation of psychological concepts. Whereas I've had people I tutor in the past who really sometimes regret choosing psychology as a subject and feel like they don't have the understanding of just sort of key concepts, and having that time and space to work through those at their own pace can just help them to sometimes have a real light bulb moment and think, oh, actually, I do get it and I will be able to sit my exam. So
Yeah.
I think lots of people have it and it's totally okay to do so.
Yeah. I wish I'd had it. And actually, the more and more I learn about myself as an adult and the more and more I learn about neurodiversity, I think I probably do fulfill the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. And when it got to the A levels, I actually really missed that accountability of the teachers making you do the work. Once it was up to me to put that accountability in place, I wasn't very good at it. the unstructured time I found really difficult to manage, and I would often be just lounging around or having a nap in the common room. Like, that's not that useful. But also because I was working on a Saturday and a Sunday and sometimes a Tuesday after work at Boots the Chemist, and also I had a boyfriend, and I wanted to see my friends. I think I had just too much on my plate, and so I was probably very tired. But I could have done with the time that I was studying to be more accountable, more focused, and more productive. I only got a C at A level. I believe I was capable of a much higher grade, but I just feel like I wasn't quite getting to the levels that you need to be able to get to. And I got a low 2-1 at university for very much the same reasons. I feel like I was capable of much more, but I needed some help and some support to be more structured.
Yeah, and I think that is such a valid point as well, because it's not just about the subject itself, let alone the fact that most people are studying more than one A level. So it's not just the psychology that they need to think about, it's what's going on the rest of the time in your life. When you're 16, 17, 18, other things are usually going on, both externally, but also in terms of your inner thoughts and how you feel about yourself and the world and what you've got to do. So it's really hard to balance that. And I wanted to just touch on what you said about sort of get what grades you got at both A level and undergraduate. I think people tend to think, well, I'm not getting an A star, so I can't do psychology, and I definitely can't be a psychologist. And that's definitely not the case. Whilst I got an A at psychology, I didn't get an A in any other A level. I missed my university offers, was absolutely devastated, thought it was the end of the world. And I'm still in touch with my A level psychology teacher today. And every year on results day, she texts me and says, I've never seen anyone so devastated as you were. I was in clearing. I went to university through clearing and then got a first class degree. So it doesn't matter if things don't always go to plan. You obviously need to work hard throughout, but you don't always need to be getting the top grades everywhere to be a good psychologist in the end.
Yeah, I hear you. And, I think I'm a reasonable psychologist and I still didn't get the best grades. I did all right at GCSEs, but I think it was that accountability. And I think I was so excited by secondary school. I worked really hard for year 7, year 8, and year 9. And then I was a bit bored of a bit bored of it. I was like, ready for a new challenge. So I probably still didn't work as hard in my GCSEs as actually I would have done if I'd sat them in year 7. I
Yeah.
might have done better then. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today. I felt like this has been a really nourishing, beautiful, wholesome exploration of health psychology and existential matters too. Have you got any advice for people if they're, to avoid burnout on the way to psychology or even within psychology?
Tough question. And I think something that personally I've definitely struggled with at times. I don't know what you think, but people who are aspiring to be or are psychologists tend to be quite hardworking, quite keen to be supportive of other people, giving, and think if you don't look after yourself within that, that can lead you into all sorts of issues, particularly if part of your job involves supporting people through really challenging emotional difficulties. It can be hard to remember to look after yourself within that. So I suppose the first thing is being aware of that. And if you do have tendency to push yourself quite hard, whatever stage you're at, whether it's A level or post qualified, I'd always say, again, accessibility is a problem, but having your own therapy has been really, or is really important for me, in understanding myself, why I might react in certain ways, and how to look after myself. But also just making time for yourself as well. And that sounds like a really cliche piece of advice, but I think I'm always tempted to do everything now and get everything done now. And unless something is imminently urgent or risky, I think it can wait for 5 minutes, an hour, or until tomorrow, and it's not going to go anywhere. So I suppose being aware of yourself, knowing what helps you and just taking a bit of time to stop and think before you keep rushing to do things, which I definitely still have to remind myself of.
Absolutely, such beautiful advice. And if people want to connect with you or follow you, where's the best place for them to do that? You mentioned the place that you do tutoring through. Feel free to mention more about how people can find you if they're like, I want Nicola to be my tutor. Give yourself a little advert. That's absolutely fine.
So tutoring wise, first tutors, if you just give that a Google and put Nicola O'Donnell in, you'll find me. So in 6 weeks' time, I will, all being well, qualify as a health psychologist. Had my Viva invitation yesterday. So you can find me on LinkedIn, just Nicola O'Donnell. I also do a lot on Twitter and on Instagram. I post a lot about being a health psychologist, the training routes, and all sorts of what a health psychologist actually does.
Thank you so much. I've absolutely adored speaking with you today. And I feel like there's so many shared interests that it's felt, really, I don't know, this just really resonated with me. And it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Wishing you the very best of luck for your Viva. There is an episode on the
Thank you.
podcast series about how to prepare optimally for your Viva. I'm sure you probably know it all already.
I
But
have listened. It was very
have
helpful.
you? Oh, good. Thank you. And obviously, anyone listening or watching, please do take a listen. Thank you so much for your time, Nicola.
Thank you for having me. It's been really nice to speak to you.
Honestly, I just love that. Like, I feel warm. I feel connected. I know that Nicola and I had a lot in common, some similar overlaps, but I hope that you feel that way about this episode as well. If you do, please take a moment to rate the podcast, to review the podcast, and to subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you are listening to or watching it on, because it helps us to reach a wider audience, and it's the single most valuable thing that you can do for any podcast that you enjoy. If you like the way that I think, the way that I talk, and you think that I might be able to help you meet some of your future or current career goals, please do check out the Aspiring Psychologist Collective book, the Clinical Psychologist Collective book, the Aspiring Psychologist membership, and of course, remember all of those wonderful back issues of the Aspiring Psychologist podcast. Thank you so much for being part of my world. Come and let me know what you think to this episode by connecting on socials. I am Dr. Marianne Trent, absolutely everywhere. And come and let me know what you think to this episode in my free Facebook group, the Aspiring Psychologist Community. You can listen to the next episode from 10 a.m. on Saturdays on YouTube and from 6 a.m. on Mondays as an MP3. Thank you so much. Stay kind to yourself, and I will see you very soon.